Traditionally, this is new material. This is stuff that will be sorry. This is stuff that will be on the final. So you have the vodcast of old stuff. If you want to review that, that's the nice thing is that's all there. If you don't want to listen to this or watch this until after the next test, that's fine, but you will have a vodcast of it. It's not traditionally or very dense material. Most of it you see in somewhere else. Most of it's a review of physio and vitamin stuff or a precursor to different stuff. We're just going to be talking about the minerals, just like we talked about the vitamins. So a lot of it's just you need to know this, you need to know this, you need to know this, which means you're going to have nice little stars in your notebook when you're done. So we're on page 170, lecture number 13, which is Macrominerals. Macrominerals. Lecture 13 and 14, the last two chapters in the book. We'll probably get through them tonight, which means it will be your last meeting with me unless you guys choose to do otherwise. My mock exam 3 is on the website somewhere. Not that you don't have different material to study, but that's up if you want to take it, and that's next week, right? So any questions on old stuff before we get on? All right. Y'all ready for this? You got the headband, you got the camo pants. So, two groups that we're going to be talking about. This first chapter is about macrominerals, the next chapter is about microminerals. Your macrominerals are calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphorus, and sulfur. He doesn't usually ask you which one's macro, which one's micro. He might, but you will need to know that. The only difference between a macromineral and a micromineral is that macrominerals are those required in quantities greater than 100 milligrams a day. In quantities greater than 100 milligrams a day, it is a macromineral. Anything less than that is a micromineral. They're always important for different stuff. So what are minerals? How are they important to us, or why are they important to us? How do they function with an enzyme in a reaction? Cofactors. They're cofactors. They're important in all the different tissues in our body. They're important for structural stuff, but they don't break down and give us energy just like vitamins don't. So that's what we're going to talk about first. And there's a bunch of little microminerals. We'll go over all of these, so I'm not going to list them. They function as cofactors of several reactions. Cofactors, not coenzymes. They function as an integral part of some proteins. Can anyone name me a mineral or two that's part of a protein? Iron. What's iron in? Hemoglobin. And myoglobin. Fantastic. What's cobalt in? The one that's like hemoglobin. Very good. It's got a porphyrin ring. The B vitamin. Its name sounds like cobalt. Cobalamin. Vitamin B12 is cobalt. Good. I didn't hear you. So, the integral part of some proteins, some hormones, some different stuff around your body. They have a role in cellular signal transduction. Give me an example. What's one of your second messengers? Calcium is one of your second messengers, so is CGMP and CAMP, but we don't care about those. Those aren't minerals. They're also very important. Calcium causes the exocytosis of vesicles. So when an action potential propagates down a neuron or down a cell into the terminus, we're talking about a neuron, into the terminus, the last step is not that the action potential causes a sodium influx. The last step is that the action potential causes a calcium influx. That's the very last thing that happens at the terminus. That calcium untethers all the vesicles full of neurotransmitters so that the neurotransmitters can hit the wall and exocytose. So calcium is actually responsible for the release of neurotransmitters, which we're going to talk about again. They maintain a physiologic ionic environment. They're absolutely important for the resting membrane potential, for different charges and different polarities. Mineralization and bone formation, and some biochemical reactions. So they do a ton of stuff, but nowhere on there does it say energy. We don't metabolize these guys. Now these are required generally, especially the microminerals, in much smaller quantities than our vitamins, than our proteins and our carbs and stuff, because we don't consume these. We just borrow them and then we return them to the system. So, most minerals are formed in salts like sodium and potassium, sodium chloride, potassium chloride, all that stuff. They're minerals, they follow all the other binding reactions, not really important. They're not readily absorbed, they're excreted in the feces, they need carrier proteins, binding proteins. We're kind of going to brush on all that, but those are just some generalizations about how this thing works. Now, good rule of thumb, minerals require an acidic environment for absorption. You're going to see that in a couple of minerals. Minerals require an acidic environment for absorption. So, what kind of things might someone take to decrease their mineral absorption, or that would decrease their mineral absorption? Acidic helps. They want an acidic environment to be absorbed. So what would decrease it? A what? Antacids, like Tums, or proton pump inhibitors, or all the stuff that like people take for gastric reflux, where they're getting GERD, where they're getting stuff back up and it's burning their esophagus. So they're like, we're just going to decrease the acidity of our stomach so it doesn't hurt. And that decreases your mineral absorption. So that's a big thing you want to look for, is people that have, that pop Tums like lifesavers. So, deficiency or disorders can occur due to clinical syndromes, dietary availability, your absorption, your transport, your binding proteins, your storage. All the same stuff that causes deficiency in vitamins can cause deficiency in minerals. In general, for this chapter, you want to know what it is, what it participates in, and what does deficiency cause and what does toxicity cause. Now, usually he wants to know your RDAs for this chapter. Did anyone ask about vitamins? Does he want your RDAs for vitamins? Okay, just vitamin C and a couple of the fat solubles? Yeah. Usually it's a couple of the fat solubles and then vitamin C. For here, I think he told you to know the RDAs, but again, check on him with that just to make sure. I'll talk to you about the RDAs just to make sure. Most foods, whole grain cereals, fruits and vegetables, dairy products, meat and fish have this. Remember, in general, fruits are good for vitamins and vegetables are good for minerals. But minerals come from the ground, right? And that's one of the big problems with soil nowadays, is we're depleting minerals as we're over farming it, because as your food grows in the ground, it's absorbed into the food you're eating and then you ingest it. So another good reason to grow your own crops on good soil. Okay, so calcium. Calcium is, TQ, the most abundant of all minerals in the body. It's the most abundant of all minerals in the body. Where do we have calcium? Bones. Fantastic. You'd think since bones are made of calcium, that's going to be very abundant. Calcium is in bones, is 99% of the calcium in the body. The other 1% is in your serum. So your serum calcium level makes up this tiny percentage. What does serum mean, by the way? Blood. So your serum calcium makes up a tiny percentage of the total available calcium in your system. Not so much, that part's not so much important for now. You will need to know that for physio. You'll talk about that heavily in physio, if you haven't already. That's physio 2, I think. It is important for bones and teeth in an important structure called calcium hydroxyapatite. Don't think he'll test you over calcium hydroxyapatite, but you do need to know that calcium is important for bones and teeth. It's required to maintain calcium homeostasis in the body. Duh. Calcium is important for calcium homeostasis. It's important for neurotransmitter release and second messenger release. We talked about this a little bit. Calcium is the second messenger in G protein coupled receptors, and calcium causes the exocytosis of the synaptic vesicles. That allows the synaptic vesicles that are full of all those neurotransmitters to hit that cell wall and dump all their stuff into the synaptic cleft, allowing for cell signaling. So not really, he doesn't get all this stuff that he gets really in detail with, he's probably not going to test you over. If you do some reviewing of any material you have, you may notice that that's a trend. He wants you to know it's important for neurotransmitter release and as a second messenger, but not so much all the details. So, good to know. It's stuff you should know. It's stuff you will need to know for boards. It's stuff you'll get taught in neuro and physio and some other stuff, but not so much for Dr. Sarkar's third or final test. It's important for muscle contractions. Why do we need calcium for muscle contractions? You guys have done this, right? You need it for action potential is good. What else? Where do we store it in muscles? Where do we store calcium in muscles? Skeletal muscle. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it comes out and allows for that whole cascade of contraction, right? The calcium is important because the action potential is propagated in by sodium, and then calciums are released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and allows for muscular contraction. So it's important there. Again, here you go. All the details that you learned in physio, not so much going to be tested on in Biochem 2, but it is very important for you to remember this stuff. Binding to tropinin C and opening the binding sites for myosin and actin to attach, et cetera, et cetera. You guys all remember that well, right? Yeah. Okay. Secretion of hormones from the endocrine cells. Again, it allows for vesicle exocytosis. Anywhere we're trying to exocytose a vesicle, these vesicles are tethered inside the cell to the filaments and the fibers inside the cell. We don't want to release them until we get a signal. That signal is the influx of calcium. When we influx calcium, it severs the tethering of the vesicles. The vesicles hit the cell wall, exocytose their contents. We allow for cell signaling or exocytosis of hormones and neurotransmitters, et cetera, et cetera. This is a big one. I would know this one. Blood clotting. I have it written here in big purple letters. What vitamin does it work intrinsically with? Vitamin K. What's the active form of vitamin K? That is a good question. It's the reduced form. Nice. It's KH2. The active form of vitamin K is KH2. And what enzyme does it indirectly affect, or what enzyme does it affect to indirectly affect the blood clotting cascade? Glutamyl carboxylase. Gamma-glutamyl carboxylase. Remember, it is a coenzyme for gamma-glutamyl carboxylase, which carboxylates those glutamate residues in clotting factors number 2, 7, 9, and 10, in clotting factors number 2, 7, 9, and 10, to increase the calcium binding affinity of 2, 7, 9, and 10. So they bind calcium so that we get a blood clot. So vitamin K and calcium work hand in hand. Make sure you know vitamin K is an indirect effect on calcium binding potential. So very important for blood clotting. Definitely know that. Activation of some proteins or enzymes, calcium kinase, calcium calmodulin kinase. You guys remember that from physio. Allows for smooth muscle contraction. Calcium ATPase, et cetera, et cetera. Important in lots of different stuff, not a huge point. A little bit about its absorption. He doesn't traditionally test on this stuff, but it might come up, so I want to talk you through it. Calcium is absorbed under what conditions? Acidic or alkali? Acidic conditions, like all of our minerals, acidic conditions. Calcium is absorbed under acidic conditions, and it's brought in either through an intestinal membrane calcium binding protein or just transported into the cell and bound to calbindin. What do you think calbindin does? Binds calcium. Specifically, it binds 2 calciums. Probably won't ask that, but just so you know. Specifically, it binds 2 calciums. It diffuses through the cell, and then it can be exocytosed in one of 2 things. It can be pumped out by a calcium ATPase, or it can be antiported by a sodium calcium antiporter. So it can be pumped out by a calcium ATPase, or it can be antiported by a sodium calcium antiporter. So what type of transport is calcium ATPase? Active transport, good. Primary or secondary active? It'd be primary active because it's burning ATP. It's an ATPase, right? Just like sodium, potassium ATPase, anything that burns an ATP is a primary active transport. What's calcium-sodium antiporter? That's secondary active because it relies on the concentration gradient set up by ATP with a sodium-potassium ATPase. You guys remember that? So sodium-potassium ATPase is always pumping sodium out and potassium in. It establishes this huge concentration gradient for sodium being outside the cell, which is going to be important here in a couple of things. And then when we want to transport stuff out, all we have to do, or when we want to transport something anywhere, all we have to do is let sodium flow in. If sodium is moving down its concentration gradient, we can move something else against its concentration gradient. So that's coupled transport. We use that all the time, and sodium's the big boy that does it. It's secondary active because it relies on the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps that set up the concentration gradients in the cells. Not going to ask you that on the test, but that is a little bit of review that will be on board. So it gets dumped out into the blood by calcium ATPase or sodium-calcium antiporters. All right, right here. Especially no acidic environment, but different things that can increase absorption. Estrogen, an acidic environment. Calcitriol, parathyroid hormone, et cetera, et cetera. Notice the first 4 are important. The other 3 are probably not important. What's calcitriol? Active form of vitamin D. Do not get it confused with what? Calcitonin, which you will notice under decreases levels of calcium. Please don't mix these up on the test. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. It increases calcium absorption. Triol. Calcitriol increases calcium absorption. So does parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone causes the synthesis of calcitriol, right? Parathyroid hormone activates the rate-limiting enzyme for vitamin D synthesis. What's the rate-limiting enzyme for vitamin D synthesis? 1-alpha hydroxylase. The rate-limiting enzyme for vitamin D synthesis is stimulated by parathyroid hormone because parathyroid hormone says what? Parathyroid hormone says what? Parathyroid hormone is equivalent to your glucagon, kind of. Parathyroid hormone says calcium's low, give me calcium. So it increases vitamin D synthesis, which is calcitriol, and it helps both of which help reabsorb calcium. Estrogen also increases calcium absorption. Why might that be important? When do you have high levels of estrogen? Not so much post-menopause, when you're pregnant. And calcium's really important when you've got a developing creature inside of you. So, not so much menopause. Menopause, your estrogen levels drop, which is why you get the leathery skin. Just something to look forward to. So, vitamin D deficiency, calcitonin, which is not calcitriol, it's the opposite of parathyroid hormone, menopause, magnesium, and phosphorus. In fact, those aren't highlighted. I would highlight those if I were you. So this is an important thing that we need to talk about here. We didn't have to talk about it so much in vitamins. Certain minerals are antagonistic to each other. Certain minerals are synergistic, certain minerals are antagonistic in terms of absorption. Yeah? Kind of. Not really what I'm talking about. Yeah, exactly. But magnesium and phosphorus will compete for absorption with calcium. Magnesium and phosphorus will compete for absorption with calcium, which means if you megadose calcium, what happens to your magnesium levels? They go down. If you megadose magnesium, what happens to your calcium levels? Down. There's a big problem with people who are told you're osteoporotic, take a large amount of calcium. They take a large amount of calcium and they end up becoming magnesium deficient. They have enough magnesium in their diet, but they're not absorbing it because just the sheer concentration gradient of calcium drives the calcium in. They don't absorb magnesium. So magnesium and phosphorus will compete with calcium for absorption. Vitamin D allows for absorption, so a lack of vitamin D stops it, and calcitonin says we don't need any more. Calcitonin is insulin for calcium. Calcitonin says we've got plenty, stop absorbing it. In adults, the RDA is 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams a day. You guys probably know that because you've probably taken calcium at some point in your life. In children, it will cause rickets. In adults, it will cause osteomalacia. What else causes those exact same deficiency conditions? Vitamin D. Because calcium and vitamin D go hand in hand. If you're deficient in vitamin D, you're deficient in calcium. Therefore, you're going to have rickets in kids and osteomalacia in adults. And it may contribute to osteoporosis, in theory. Although adding calcium does not seem to have any clinical effect on it, just FYI. Calcium toxicity, more than 2,000 milligrams a day, can lead to toxicity, or if you have too much vitamin D, hypervitaminosis D, because vitamin D does what to calcium? Increases absorption. Vitamin D increases absorption to calcium. Or hypercalcemia due to hyperparathyroidism. Have you guys talked about this one yet? Is that try 3 physio? What's parathyroid hormone do? We kind of talked about it last time. Calls for calcium. Says we have low calcium. How does it get calcium? It does osteoclasts and it does vitamin D synthesis. So parathyroid hormone does two things. It does vitamin D synthesis to absorb calcium, and it does osteoclasts to break down bone to free calcium. So hyperparathyroidism would mean you'd have too much parathyroid hormone. If you have too much parathyroid hormone, you're going to get too much calcium. It can lead to toxicity conditions. Mainly it causes stones and calcification. Stones and calcification. That's the ones you want to know. It causes kidney stones and it causes soft tissue calcification. If you have too much calcium, it's going to go somewhere. Questions? That's it for calcium. All right, you guys are on it. So these ones will start to go a little faster. Phosphorus, Structure and function of all living cells. How is it structural to all living cells? Phosphorus. Every cell in your body needs phosphorus. What? Yeah, true. That's very true. It needs energy. It needs energy. Structural. How is it structural to all living cells? Say it loud. The phospholipid bilayer. Phosphorus is in every cell in your body because you need a phospholipid bilayer for every cell in your body, which needs a single phosphorus for every single one of your phospholipids. That's a ton of phosphorus. Not as much calcium, but I think it's the second largest quantity mineral in your body. He won't ask you that. So it exists in many ways: phospholipids, free ions, nucleic acids, et cetera, et cetera. It's also a constituent of bones and teeth. Calcium and phosphorus go hand in hand. You need one calcium. Well, I don't know if it's exactly 1-to-1. I think it's 1-to-1 calcium and phosphorus to build bones, to build teeth. So calcium and phosphorus go hand in hand for bones and teeth. Phosphorylated metabolic intermediates, in other words, glucose 6-phosphate and fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, phosphorylated intermediates. Nucleic acids, the physiologic buffer, which is your phospholipid bilayer. Protein phosphorylation, and he doesn't even list on there ATP, ADP, AMP, GTP, CTP, UTP, etc., etc. All of your money, all of your energy currency of your body. The regulation of phosphate is mediated by 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol. What's 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol? Active form. Active form of vitamin D. Remember, I told you, vitamin D causes reabsorption of calcium, reabsorption of phosphorus. Reabsorption of calcium, reabsorption of phosphorus. So if vitamin D is around, or you will signal for vitamin D when either phosphate levels are low or calcium levels are low. When phosphate's low or calcium's low, vitamin D goes up. You reabsorb phosphate and calcium. When phosphate or calcium are low, vitamin D goes up. You reabsorb phosphate and calcium. Cool? And deposition of phosphate as hydroxyapatite in bone is controlled by parathyroid hormone. What does parathyroid hormone do to bone? Osteoclast. So what does parathyroid hormone do to bone? Breaks it down. If you break down bone, do you have more or less phosphate in it? Less phosphate. You're breaking it out of the bone. Good. So parathyroid breaks down bone, liberates calcium, liberates phosphate. The excretion of phosphate occurs mainly in the kidney. Lots of wonderful information there. I'm going to sum it up real quick for you. Every little bit of phosphate in our body is filtered when it hits the kidney. We reabsorb what we need. I think it mentions it. You have to take like a super dose to get phosphate toxicity. We are great at excreting phosphate. It gets filtered. We reabsorb what we need. What tells us how much to reabsorb? 1,25-dihydroxycholecalciferol, which causes phosphate reabsorption. So if we have vitamin D around that says our phosphate levels are low, we reabsorb phosphate. If we don't reabsorb phosphate. It all goes out in the urine. That's what all that's saying, and it's probably more than the test needs to know. That'll be really important for physio, but not so much for biochem. Adult, 700 milligrams a day. Again, these are all greater than 100. So if you know your macros, if you memorize your macros, don't guess anything less than 100 if he happens to ask you an RDA. If you know your micros, don't guess anything more than 100 if he happens to ask you an RDA, because macros are all 100 or greater, micros are all below that. So, phosphorus deficiency from diminished absorption or wasting. If it's just being excreted, you can't reabsorb it. The use of aluminum hydroxide containing antacids. A, antacids decrease mineral absorption in general, and B, aluminum hydroxide binds phosphorus. So, antacids in general will decrease absorption. Low vitamin D absorption, because vitamin D says what to phosphorus? Vitamin D says what to phosphorus? Reabsorb it. So, if you have low vitamin D, you're going to get deficiency. In adults and kids, it causes osteomalacia and rickets. I hope you guys remember those now. Phosphorus, calcium, vitamin D, osteomalacia, rickets. Phosphorus, calcium, vitamin D, osteomalacia, rickets. Toxicity is super rare except for chronic kidney failure, or acute or chronic kidney failure, because then you can't excrete it, but we're really good at it. Low serum calcium stimulates secondary that should say, depending on what version of whatever you have, hyperparathyroidism. So if your serum calcium is low, for whatever reason, you will stimulate the you'll stimulate parathyroid hormone. You'll get hyperparathyroidism. We'll talk about all that next try, which means you're going to break down a lot of bone. You're going to liberate a lot of free phosphorus. You might have too much phosphorus in your blood at that point. It's in lots of stuff. It's in pretty much everything. Questions on phosphorus? You guys doing all right? All right. Sodium. Sodium, TQ, 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 is the principal cation in extracellular fluid. You were asked that in cells and tissues, and you will be asked that many other times. Sodium is the principal cation in extracellular fluid. It is very important for maintaining plasma volume. Really easy rule of thumb, water follows sodium. Wherever there's sodium, there's water. Wherever there's sodium, there's water. So, if there's too much sodium in your blood, you reabsorb water, it increases plasma volume. Too little sodium, you lose water, it decreases plasma volume. It's important for plasma volume. Acid-base balance, electrochemical gradients. Specifically, here we go. It maintains the resting membrane potential. Please know that. Sodium and potassium, and we're going to cover it when we hit potassium, are very important for the resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential. You guys know that? You cool with that? Sodium-potassium pump? It's important for nerve function. Fantastic. Mainly saltatory conduction. Why? How does it have to do with nerve function? Maintains the resting membrane potential, and it's responsible for the depolarization phase, right? So, and it's important for cardiac function. Increases in dietary intake of sodium increase diastolic blood pressure. How does it increase the blood pressure? Anyone want to take a guess? How does sodium increase blood pressure? Because sodium follows water, and water raises your blood pressure if you get too much volume, right? So if you have a high sodium diet, this is why they tell you if you have high blood pressure to get on a low sodium diet. Because you have less sodium in your blood, which means you have less water in your blood, less volume in your blood. Less volume equals less pressure. Fantastic. So, very important for cardiac function, specifically in terms of hypertension. Important for renal function and important for muscle function. Great little TQs. Not so much TQs. The reabsorption of sodium is regulated by aldosterone. The reabsorption of sodium is regulated by aldosterone. Please know aldosterone. You'll have to know it for physio if you don't already. Aldosterone causes the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. Aldosterone causes the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. So what else do you think I'm going to talk, or where else do you think I'm going to talk about aldosterone? When we get to potassium. So, aldosterone causes the reabsorption of sodium and the excretion of potassium. RDA, 1.5 grams a day, which is actually really generous for a mineral, right? 1.5 grams, that's a lot. Think about it in terms of salt intake, though. That's about 1/5 of a teaspoon. 1/5 of a teaspoon of sodium. Now, granted, most of the sodium you eat is sodium chloride, so it's not an equal weight. So it's not, I don't know what the conversion is based on weight. But think about how much sodium you actually need to intake and how much we as Americans do. Because even I don't add a lot of salt to my stuff, and I'm sure I get more than 1/5 of a teaspoon, let alone all that salted stuff you get. So RDA for sodium is 1.5 grams a day. Have you ever looked at Carl's Jr.? They're like 5,000 milligrams of sodium, 5 grams of sodium in one burger. Not good for you, but they're delicious. But yeah, it's a preservative. Yeah, that's where it came about. They figured it out, salted meat. Okay, sodium deficiencies or decreases are unknown on a normal diet, especially in America. You do not get sodium deficiency. You can if you're like in a desert and you're walking around with nothing to do whatever and you sweat profusely, but you're more likely to get dehydrated than deficient sodium. Sodium toxicity disease is hypertension. So you never see the deficiency, but if you're toxic, it's going to cause hypertension because what follows sodium? Water follows sodium. Fantastic. Questions? Is this all right? You guys cool with this method? Okay. Potassium is the principal cation in intracellular fluid. TQ, TQ, TQ. You think those ones are going to come up on the test? Yes. Principal cation extracellular fluid is? Principal cation intracellular fluid is? Potassium, good. Intracellular potassium, extracellular sodium. It maintains the electrolyte balance between intracellular and extracellular, and it maintains the resting membrane potential, very similar to sodium. It's readily absorbed in the small intestine, and TQ, K plus reabsorption and secretion, is regulated by aldosterone, because aldosterone causes sodium reabsorption and potassium excretion. Probably won't have to know that for the test, but it will help you out, especially in physio. But they both are regulated by aldosterone. You will have to know that. Sodium reabsorption, potassium excretion. Sodium reabsorption, potassium excretion. Aldosterone is triggered when your blood pressure drops. So when your kidneys sense low blood pressure or low sodium, and they interpret low blood pressure, it sends for aldosterone to get more sodium in, so you get more water out of the urine, and you raise your blood pressure. So aldosterone signals sodium in reabsorption, potassium out. Adult RDA, 4.7 grams per day, which is approximately triple, it's more than triple that of sodium. You need you're supposed to have a 3-to-1 ratio of potassium to sodium in a normal diet. Do you think we get that? No. You're supposed to have a 3-to-1 diet of potassium to sodium, which is not something we get as Americans especially. So, just a little clinical FYI. Deficiency, disease, or symptoms occurs secondary to illness, injury, or diuretic therapy. Why diuretic therapy? Yeah. Diuretic therapy, you're losing lots of water, you're not reabsorbing stuff. Good. Causes muscular weakness, paralysis, mental confusion. Probably not going to come up, but that condition, is called hypokalemia. Hypokalemia with a K. You'll talk a lot about that in physio. Oh, here you go. Hypo would be deficiency, hyper would be too much. Excessive in the plasma causes renal problems, heart diseases, and here's hypokalemia. Causes intracellular acidosis. Never heard of that. It's in the notes, it's highlighted, but I never heard of it. He probably won't bring that up. So if anything, he'll talk about the muscle weakness associated with decreases in potassium. You'll really stress that stuff in physio. That's not a big focus of biochemistry. He puts it in here for you guys to learn and kind of integrate with physio, but it's not a huge focus of his test. Toxicity or disease, more than 20 grams a day can result in toxicity leading to TQ, cardiac arrest. I would know that one. Too much potassium, massive amounts of potassium, can lead to cardiac arrest. Basically, it causes muscle tetany. Cool. Chloride, major anion in the extracellular fluid. Major anion in the extracellular fluid. Does anyone know what the major anion in the intracellular fluid is? Not a mineral. It's your proteins. The major intracellular anion is the proteins that you have inside your cell, which are all very negatively charged. So, extracellular cation is sodium. Intracellular cation is potassium. Extracellular anion is chloride, and intracellular anion is proteins. Fantastic. Fluid and electrolyte balance, maintenance of the membrane potential, and this one's important, the production of HCl by the parietal cells of the stomach. Why is chloride needed for the production of HCl? Because it's HCl. So you better get that one on the test. If he says, you have deficient chloride, which one of these is deficient? Please put HCl, because it says Cl in it. So, 95 to 98% is reabsorbed. That's the case with pretty much every one of our vitamins and or every one of our minerals. Like 95 to 98% are reabsorbed, so don't worry about it. Adult RDA, approximately 1.2 grams per day. Deficiency can cause in infants being fed a salt-free formula. Do you think Americans are usually deficient in chloride? Why? Because it's in salt, because it's sodium chloride. Table salts, NaCl. Good. So we're not usually deficient in chloride. Secondary to vomiting and diuretic therapy, so if you're losing a lot of chloride somewhere, whether you're puking it out, why would puking make you lose chloride? You lose a lot of electrolytes, but not so much that. What do you lose out of your stomach? You're losing all the acid. So what does your body do? It makes more acid. So you vomit more acid. So every time you vomit, you lose a lot of acid. And that's actually something you'll talk about in physio. Vomiting causes metabolic alkalosis. You lose so much acid from your system that your body goes into alkalosis, basicness. It's better than acidosis, but not in terms of what the times we're talking about. If you're vomiting enough to cause alkalosis, that's a problem. I don't know at what point they call here's the danger level or even how they measure that. Yeah.
It makes me curious because you're like, oh, you need to be more alkaline.
The problem is you buffer alkalinity and acidosis with breathing. So you buffer them through the kidneys and you buffer them with breathing. If I hyperventilate, I get rid of all my CO2 and I become alkaline. If I hypoventilate, I keep all my CO2, I become acidic. So regardless of what you do dietarily, your breathing regulates your body's acid-base balance. No, the primary mechanism of action is your breathing, and then it goes and deals with kidneys, and then it has some long-term stuff. Actually, the primary one is your buffer system, your bicarbonate system that keeps your bases and acids intact, and then your breathing, and then your kidneys. So you have all this stuff intact to regulate it. So, yeah. You're right, though. You should eat more alkaline foods. But what would eating a very alkaline diet do for vitamin and mineral absorption, or for mineral absorption? It would decrease it. That's not usually a problem. I mean, if you eat lots of fruits and vegetables, which are primarily alkaline, you're not going to not get enough vitamins and minerals, mainly because you're eating a ton of vitamins and minerals. So, but just cool stuff. That answer your question? Yeah. Magnesium, constituents of bones and teeth. Involved in the central pathways of carbohydrate, lipid, and protein metabolism. We'll talk about why here in a minute, so it'll make a lot of sense. It is essential for all reactions in which ATP is a substrate. I told you that before. Every single reaction that uses ATP, or actually any transfer of a phosphate, period. Any transfer of a phosphate, doesn't have to be ATP, it can be GTP or CTP or UTP. Any transfer of a phosphate needs magnesium. Magnesium actually serves as the true substrate. So magnesium picks up a phosphate and then, picks up an ATP here, and then it moves the ATP or uses the ATP, etc. Make sure you know that. Make sure you know that magnesium is in every ATP-consuming reaction. I think he does all phosphates, but he doesn't list that here, so no ATP. Which means it's important for all kinase reactions, all ATPase reactions, and he also lists polymerases, which are DNA polymerization. Why would it be important for polymerization? Anyone know? What's the backbone of DNA? Phosphate backbone. So if you have phosphate backbone, what's your donor for phosphates? ATP. So you must have magnesium. That's a big TQ. You will ask this one. Magnesium is important for all ATP reactions, ATP-consuming reactions. Which is why it's important for carbs, lipids, and proteins, because anytime you need to use ATP or make ATP, you need a magnesium. And TQ, remember I said you need to know the stuff that competes with each other? It competes with calcium, which is why someone who's taking a lot of calcium for osteoporosis is going to have problems with magnesium, because it's just being outcompeted by the absorption. So magnesium and calcium compete with each other. Megadosing calcium decreases magnesium, and vice versa. Make sure you guys know those. Those two will probably come up, or one of those two. Too much calcium leads to a deficiency of magnesium. Too much magnesium leads to a deficiency of calcium. Yes, magnesium and phosphorus both lead to a deficiency of calcium. But in terms of this one, magnesium and calcium compete here. He didn't even mention that, phosphorus. RDA, 300 to 400 milligrams a day. Magnesium, 300 to 400 milligrams a day. Malabsorption or diarrhea is going to lead to magnesium deficiency, just like everything else, losing too much, not eating enough. GI disorders, renal disorders, protein malnutrition, etc., etc. Magnesium toxicity can lead to disease, depressed deep tendon reflexes and respiration. Probably not going to talk about this stuff on your test. Mostly he deals with stuff like this, like what the reactions are, what it competes with, not so much these minor little things. And lastly, sulfur produces disulfide bridges between sulfur-containing amino acids, so it's really important for protein structure, right? It's a component of some coenzymes, specifically biotin and thiamine. Amino acids, cysteine and methionine. S-adenosylmethionine, taurine, and glutathione. No serious deficiency is known for that. So on this one, it's important for coenzymes, specifically biotin and thiamine, your sulfur-containing amino acids, you dang well better know that one, and SAM, which has an S in the name, S-adenosylmethionine. I would also know glutathione. He loves glutathione. It's a big antioxidant, and that's about it. So, that was macrominerals. Do you guys want to call it a day and do the last hour next week? Okay.
Or should we do a review next week? I kind of want to do like a review.
Okay.
I mean, we could do.
Yeah, it won't take long.
Well, and you're going to say you don't have to come, but I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Because the test is on Thursday next week, I think. Wednesday.
That's the last chapter we have?
Yep. And it's really, how many pages is it? I know some physio.
Get money out of my car right now. I will find an ATM. I'm not even kidding.
Yeah, we'll do this next week. It's not worth doing tonight, but we'll figure it out. All right. I'm going to turn off the mic. Thank you guys for being here.